Good evening. This is Professor Indira Jha talking to Degree 2 students of English Honours. Unfortunately, the classes are suspended because of the coronavirus, so we are not having the classes with you. So today I thought to talk to you on the play which we were learning in the class, the play by Christopher Marlowe, Edward II. Actually, I want to focus on certain important points of the play so that you can prepare yourself for your forthcoming examination. First of all, I would like to talk about the theme of the play. Among all the plays of Marlowe, Edward II occupies a distinct place. It is the first play in which Marlowe dwells on English history and which the canvas is not dominated by the central figure alone. It is based on Holinshed's Chronicles. The question arises why Marlowe chose the, comparative, the comparatively unattractive reign of Edward II out of all the rich material provided by Holinshed. According to according to Charlton and Waller, Marlowe was first drawn to the subject by the pathos and horror of Edward's end. There is no doubt that the reluctant pangs of abdicating royalty, as Lamb put it, and the death of Edward II provide the most remarkable scenes in this play. It is, however, very unlikely that Marlowe chose the reign of Edward II solely for the purpose of underlying his horrible and tragic end. Marlowe plunged into his plots without much forethought of what the ending would be. Besides, it was the quest of something infinite that often inspired him in his works. Therefore, the theme of the play is all for love or the world well lost. Edward's love for Gaveston is extreme. Inspired by the love of his minion, he uses the word which reminds us of Tamburlaine. He tells the haughty barons, "Ere my sweet Gaveston shall part from me, this isle shall fleet upon the ocean, and wander to the unfrequented Inde." He is ready to lose the whole world so that he may get a corner to frolic with his minion. Nor in this love one-sided. Gaveston and his followers begin loving the king in order to rise into the world. To put it in other words, their love had a touch of policy, but soon they became devoted to him, ready to die or live with him. The love that has been exploited in Edward II is not the love between man and woman. In fact, Marlowe uses the theme of love between two sexes only in his earlier play Dido. The amour between Edward and Gaveston is the love between man and man, and it is more than mere friendship. It is the type of love which Jove for the Ganymede in Dido or Neptune had for Leander in Hero and Leander. The elder Mortimer thinks that such kind of love is only natural for kings and great persons. The mightiest king have had their minions. Great Alexander loved Hephaestion, the conquering Hercules for Hylas wept, and for Patroclus stern Achilles drooped. Edward cherishes the same kind of love from Gaveston as a man cherishes from a woman, according to the Queen. He dotes upon the love of Gaveston. He claps his cheeks and hangs about his neck, smiles in his face and whispers in his ears. This is nothing but homoeroticism. To ignore the presence of to ignore the presence or to minimize the impact of such motivation in Edward II, as most of its critics discreetly tend to do, is to distort the meaning of the play. According to the testimony of Kidd, Marlowe dared to suspect an extraordinary love between St. John and Jesus. even comparing them, according to Baines, with the sinners of Sodom. It is this love which brings about the tragedy of Edward II. Mario Praz, a leading expert on problems of literary pathology, has called Marlowe's obsession with homoeroticism as Ganymede complex. He would interpret Marlowe's thirst for the impossible as a sublimation of Marlowe's attitude towards sex. We may or may not agree with Mario Praz, but we will have to admit that homoeroticism is one of the obsessions of Marlowe. A critic would interpret the horrible death of King Edward, caused by a red hot spit plunged into his intestines, as a parody of the vice. Thus, homosexual affection, for which Edward II considers the world well lost, is the main theme of the play. The horror and pathos of his end occupies a secondary place as a source of inspiration for the play. To continue, my dear students, we also need to consider that the theme is homosexuality, pathos, terror, etc. But how Edward II is a tragedy, this also need to be focused upon. Edward II is a unique achievement of Marlowe. Though it is essentially a chronicle play, Marlowe has succeeded in turning it into a most powerful personal tragedy. So please remember that it is a personal tragedy. Marlowe is a tireless experimenter. He introduces a new kind of tragedy in Tamburlaine, a tragedy of ambition, which devotes a large part of it to exhibit the rise of commoners instead of the fall of the princes. After Tamburlaine, he took to writing a revenge play, The Jew of Malta, and left his indelible expression on it. In Edward II, his creative imagination ranges at home. He draws on Holinshed, Fabian, and Stowe and picks out the pitiful tragedy of this king's time. Its framework is that of a chronicle play, but Marlowe uses it for creating a most personal type of tragedy. The tragedy in Edward II arises out of Edward's abundant infatuation for Gaveston, as we know, and after his death for Spencer and Baldock. He dotes on his minions to the extent of neglecting his state and family duties. Like other heroes of Marlowe, he goes to the extreme in love of man for man, which happens to be the theme of Edward II. The emotion that he cherishes in his heart for Gaveston is of a most personal sort. It would have done less harm had Edward been merely an individual. But as fate would have it, he is also a king without kingliness. Other heroes of Marlowe are not born kings, but they have inherent kingliness of nature. It is the reverse with Edward. He is born as a king, but his nature is that of an aesthete and epicure. This is the cause of his fall. The tragic flaw of his character is the maladjustment between the claims of the self and those of the world at large. Like all tragedies, Edward II too depends on conflict for its effect. The conflict in the play is not in the soul of a man as it is in Macbeth. It is a well-defined conflict and external in nature. There are two parties in the play, the party of the king and the party of the barons. The king picks a quarrel with the barons for the sake of his love for Gaveston. Initially, he loses, and the barons succeed in executing his minion Gaveston. The grief at Gaveston's death goads Edward to extent that his actions are defeated. The barons, the barons execute most of them while he commits Mortimer to the Tower. The escape of Mortimer to France is a turning point in the fortunes of the king. Now the party of the barons gives way to the party of the Queen and Mortimer. Through an overcrowded action, sometimes swaying in favor of the king, and more often than not in favor of the barons and their associates, Marlowe takes us to the capture of the king. Henceforward, he starts exploiting tragic emotions of pity and terror. Initially, it is more pity and less terror, and subsequently, it is more horror and less terror that Marlowe arouses. For making us alive to the horror and pathos at the end of Edward, he has to bring about a change in our feelings towards the king, though at the cost of consistency in plot and characterization. After the capture of the king, the pace of action slows down. Edward now appears in a position in which he can do no mischief. His redeeming qualities come to the fore. All this has been done very skillfully without making us conscious of the change that takes place in us. After winning our sympathies for this hero, Marlowe dwells on his tragic situation. The king, as Marlowe presents him in the last scenes, is like a hunted animal surrounded by the hounds. He has not the faintest hope of assistance. He faints, laments, rages, and at last, remorselessly, the character of his life is darkened. Mortimer and the Queen grow more and more hateful. The kindly Berkeley is replaced by Matrevis and Gurney. Kent is executed. The last light up disappears, and through the abysmal darkness rings a sudden cry of pan-stricken agony. Unexpectedly, the light of day returns, and we shudder at the horror past. Marlowe dwells on every detail of the horror of the king's situation. His passionate outbursts show his utter misery, but he is not repentant. He doesn't know how he has erred, if it not be with too much clemency. Indignities are heaped on him. He is kept standing in the stinking channel. He is given channel water to drink and is not allowed to sleep with continual drum beating. His beard is shaved off with channel water. The most heart-rending spectacle is of the king, who has grown outworn, outwatched, and terrified, apologizing to Lightborn and giving him his last jewel. But every joint aches as I give it thee, and trembling in extremity of fear, something still buzzeth in mine ears, and tells me, if I sleep, I never wake. These last scenes are highly powerful, and they bring the political powers of Marlowe to the fore. Much of their effect is due to a certain naturalistic quality. The dialogue is realistic and so dreadful that the fact that the sufferer is Edward and a king is of little importance. Our feeling would be no less treated even if he were nameless and unknown. The reluctant pangs of abdicating royalty in Edward furnishes hints which Shakespeare scarce improved in his Richard II. And the death scene of Marlowe's king moves pity and terror beyond any scene, ancient or modern, with which anyone is acquainted. Edward II is a tragedy, and it is the tragedy of an individual who incidentally happens to be a king. The tragic vision embodied in this play shows the antithesis between personal emotion and social claims, and how irreconcilable they are. For a certain extent, it is a conventional type of tragedy which shows the fall of an individual through a weakness in his nature. The emotions aroused are pathos and horror. The dramatist overwhelms us with his powerful lines and great poetic powers. Some of the critics have regarded Edward II to be the best play of Marlowe because of its tragic unity and tragic power. To conclude, my dear students, I just want to say that please pay attention to this lecture and listen to it again and again to see three things. One, the theme of the play. Second, the plot of the play. And third, the tragic elements in the play. And after looking at the tragic elements, you should never forget that Edward II is also a chronicle play because Marlowe has dwelt upon the history, and that history he has tried to depict as far as possible, but the personal tragedy, I would say, is more dominant than the history. Thank you very much, and I would like to know that how many of you could learn Edward II's important elements. Thank you.